Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
Hello, welcome to Dairy Pod. I'm Mikaela Baker, Extension Advisor and Farm Engagement Lead from Dairy Australia. With autumn having just arrived, we are now right amongst the key time for preparing for autumn sowing. Most farms will have made a plan or be receiving the calls from their agronomists checking what they would like to put in the ground. So it is the perfect time to have a chat about the first step in a great productive pasture. Welcome and thank you, Kevin and Graeme, for joining me today to discuss the Forage Value Index. I'd first like to introduce Professor Kevin Smith. He is a Professorial Fellow at AgVic Research and a Professor at the University of Melbourne. So before we get really into it, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in the dairy industry and your research space?
Thanks, Mikaela. And so as Mikaela's introduced, I'm a researcher working with Agriculture Victoria and University of Melbourne, and I've worked for a long time now in the fields of pasture science, particularly around the breeding and evaluation of new pasture species, and more now in the use of digital technologies such as satellites and drones to both measure and breed new pastures. But I guess my real passion is working closely with Dairy Australia and seed companies to ensure that these new technologies that we develop actually find their ways onto farm and farmers make the right choices in terms of how to use these technologies, either in terms of seeds, endophytes, or also drone technologies or other technologies for measuring pastures. So we've been very actively involved with Dairy Australia in the development of the science and economics behind the Forage Value Index. So we'll talk about that later in the podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. And that sounds like a very exciting and relevant space to be working in. And we also have here with us Graeme Nicoll. He's a dairy farmer from Fish Creek in South Gippsland and a passionate pasture man. And so, Graeme, can you please paint us a bit of a picture of your background, your farming system, about your cows, and just your general approach to farming?
Thanks, Mikaela. I've been farming here in South Gippsland for about 20 years, or a bit over 20 years now. We farm on a couple of different blocks over 350 hectares, calving down about 340 crossbred cows in a single calving each year on a milking platform of about 120 hectares. And then all our non-dairy replacement calves are raised in a beef block as well. So our pasture production, our pasture consumption is one of the key profit drivers in our business. In a rainfall of just over 1,000 mils, we've already invested in being able to grow a lot of grass, having the land we farm on. So we really try and capitalise on our pasture production within our system.
Yeah, fantastic. And we're all aware of the strong importance of pasture utilisation and its association with more profitable and resilient farms, which sounds like something that you're both really invested in. And a key part of that is making sure that you have the best varieties selected on your farm so that you can give your pastures a chance to maximise yield and quality. And it's that time of year, like we mentioned, where everyone's looking at now deciding which pasture varieties to sow on their farms. And this is where the FVI has been developed as a tool to help dairy farmers choose the most profitable and highest yielding varieties for their region or their calving pattern as well. So Kevin, if you could get us started, can you give our listeners a brief summary of exactly what the FVI is and why was it developed?
Yep. So what the FVI is a tool that assists dairy producers with making the choice between the right variety or cultivar to sow on their farms based on the relative differences between them. And producers are well used to using this kind of tool and technology when they're choosing between bulls, when they're making semen purchases. And so it's really a very similar concept to that kind of genetic evaluation in animals, where you have a range of traits and we try and weight them based on their relative economic importance to a dairy producer. So when we started this project, all the data that existed was usually trial by trial, and farmers had to make their own interpretation of, let's say, is a kilogram of dry matter worth more in winter than autumn? What's it worth in summer? And try and bring that together. So it wasn't that they were making bad choices, it's just that it was a very complex and subjective way of going about it. So at that time, there were also products being pioneered in Ireland, and the Irish version's called the Pasture Profit Index, and in New Zealand, by Dairy New Zealand, called the Forage Value Index, so same name as ours. And I guess the basic principle, as I've said, is that they source data from pasture cultivar trials and then use that data that comes from those cultivar trials to come up with this weighted index that we call in Australia the Forage Value Index. So in Australia, there is a network of these cultivar trials around the country that are run by a company called the Pasture Trial Network. So that's a set of independent trials where seed companies send their material, it gets tested independently and comes up with the relative performance of those trials, mostly in the past based on their variation for the amount of grass that's produced and the differences between varieties. So producers can go to that Pasture Trial Network website and look for the exact trials that might be in their area if they wish to do that. But we take that data, we aggregate it and come up with these estimates of the relative performance of the cultivars for seasonal yield. And we split the year into 5 seasons. So we break spring into early spring and late spring, but across those 5 seasons. And this year, for the first time as well, we've added data on the relative differences of the energy concentration, or ME, of the varieties. So we now have an index that's looking at seasonal yield and seasonal energy. And then the final step, and I'm sorry if it's a bit complicated, is we then add a economic value to those performance values. So we say you've got 1 kilo of extra of dry matter in this variety and 1.1 of an extra ME in this variety. And we look at the relative value of that in each of the dairy regions of Australia to come up with that index. So they're mathematically combined, and that's what producers see on the website that Dairy Australia host.
Great. So the FVI covers annual ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, Italian ryegrass, and then it also has some hybrid options in there as well. Does it have the ME and economic values for each of those?
So the ME values at the moment are for perennial ryegrass first. So this is the innovation first there. But the yield values are for all those different species. So if the farmer is making a choice and saying we're going down a perennial renovation system, they'll be able to look at both the energy and the yield. But if they're looking at either annual or Italian ryegrass options, at the moment, it's a yield-based index based on the different values of yield in spring versus winter versus autumn. So that new addition of the ME into the index for perennial ryegrass is really part of the ongoing evolution of the FEI, which we started in around about 2017. And at that time, it was a perennial ryegrass only tool, and we've added the Italians and the annual ryegrasses. But what we are doing is a similar approach, again, similar to animal genetic evaluation, where before we put the new trait into the index, we'll actually put some values for the new trait just on the table, but not yet in the index, as we're getting more data and having those relate to more varieties. So although the forage value index at the moment for annual and Italian ryegrass does not include metabolizable energy or ME, the data that we have for that trait for those species is available on the table, and we're working through the methodology to bring that into the index in future times. And so that approach is the one we've used with the FEI since 2017. As we add more trials and we add more traits, we work to improve the index over time. So the table includes both the index that's available now and any information on new traits that we're measuring, but also information as to whether cultivars are diploids or tetraploids, what endophyte they have, which company owns the variety, etc. So dairy producers can use that information to actually compare like with like across companies, and when they talk to their seed retailers at the kind of options they have available.
And it also helps them sort of build a story and a plan on their farm of what things that they do want, and to be able to work together and work in with the animals. And so, Graeme, I'd love to know what your experience is with selecting varieties on your farm over the years, and what it is you look for when you are selecting varieties.
Yeah, I like data in our business. Data helps us make good decisions, and I've been using the Forage variety trials FEI since it started. I was using the Irish and the New Zealand offerings before the Australian offering was in the marketplace. And in all honesty, I still refer to the New Zealand offering just as a bench, as a double check, because there's different varieties turn up in different offerings. But it's helped me I can identify where my feed gaps is and where I need feed in our business, and then look at varieties that produce feed or have an inclination to produce feed in that part of the season. Being a dryland farm where we don't have any irrigation, but we do grow summer grass because we are a long way south. Varieties that have good late spring, summer production are critical for our business to keep our production going through the season. So the FEI data helps me select varieties that suit our production type. And at the moment, I'm going through that process for our business and looking at varieties that we need in our dairy beef operation. So it's a different timing operation. It's a different scale. So I use different pasture species in that part of our operation.
Yes, because the FEI is a fantastic tool where you can look at it and you can see all of the different pasture varieties there available, and it does rank them. But if you have different goals on your farm, you're not going to be looking for just the one with the highest number. You're going to be looking for the one that has the flowering date that you want, or a novel endophyte that you might prefer. Have you had any experience with using different endophytes, or do you find that part of the tool useful as well?
Definitely. And yes, definitely. It's not a matter of looking at the table, picking the one that's on the top of the list, the one that's got the most points. It's that range of data that Kevin's talked about that's in the FEI is really valuable. Running a lot of young dairy calves, raising all our dairy beef, then endophytes become an issue. So in pastures where we run the dairy calves and the dairy beef calves, I'm very selective on what endophytes we use, because we've worked out over the years certain endophytes cause us problems and others don't. So that's part of it. And that ME, being able to see the ME figures nowadays, the metabolizable energy, that's actually what we're growing the grass for. We're not growing the grass to grow tons of feed. We're trying to get energy into our animals. So that becomes a critical part of it as well.
So, Graeme, you made a point about endophytes that you didn't like. So what are the ones that you have the most challenges with?
We have had challenges in the past particularly with our young stock, with standard endophytes. Ryegrass staggers becomes a significant issue at this time of the year, when the calves are probably eating down into the base of that pasture a bit further than what we'd normally like, but it's hard to stop at this time of the year. So we, for the areas, particularly for the calf areas, we target those novel endophytes, which will give us some sort of protection from pest species in the pasture, but minimize those animal health issues with our calves. And I guess as a flow on in our business, we're like, well, if we're seeing such a significant impact on our calves, I'm guessing we're getting significant issues in our milking herd that we're not really picking up. It's being masked by other things. So I wouldn't plant a pasture species on our farm that wasn't a novel endophyte. All our dairy platform, any new pastures that's been sown on this farm in the last at least 15 years has been a novel endophyte species.
So a standard endophyte, that would be a naturally occurring endophyte that we might see in Victorian ryegrass, for example. But the novel endophytes are the ones that they're specifically designed to not cause too many animal health issues.
And this is, from a farmer's perspective, becomes a little bit challenging, because every seed company is bringing out a new endophyte every year, and it's better than the last one. And it's always going to be whiz bang. And so from a farmer's perspective, it's a challenging space to keep up with. I was going to say the science, but I actually changed that to keep up with the marketing rather than the science, because I think it's marketing more than science a lot of the times. But we do need some endophytes in our pastures to stop things like black beetle attack. And so they're a critical part of our mix. And it's something we're really relying on the pasture breeders to get right for us. So, Kevin, I wouldn't mind asking you a little bit about the ME range in the Italian and the annual ryegrass, because I see that's come into the FEI of late. And from my perspective, I kind of look at it as, okay, is there any species or any varieties of ryegrass here that are significantly different to the others? And, roughly the way I look at the data set is they're all roughly similar. Is this the reason why it's not part of the index? And in the long term, is it much value when the range isn't great to introduce it into the index?
It's a very interesting question, Graeme. And I think that there's a couple of answers to that. One is that at the moment, most companies are not actively selecting for ME. So the differences that are there, some of the differences are between the diploid and the tetraploid varieties. So tetraploids tend to be a bit higher, diploids tend to be a bit lower. And I guess the other thing that I'd say is that when it is relatively expensive to screen for these nutritive characteristics, it's not until you can express the value of the improvement that you send the market signal to a breeding company to actually start to breed for that. And we've seen that in the animal evaluation systems. So I think it's good to know that the differences aren't as great as we might have thought sometimes, because then it does tell us that we can select higher yielding varieties without sacrificing quality, which is important because, as you said, we are about understanding the both the yield and ensuring that yield is of adequate nutritional quality for our animals. I think what we'll see over time, unfortunately, is that decision become more complex as we see high yielding and high energy varieties, or maybe some super high energy varieties that may not be quite as high yielding in some seasons. So that's where the finesse comes into it in the future. So I would say it's definitely worth having in there, just so that you're getting the relative importance in your decision making. And in all these things, when we're talking about genetics and biology and then overlaying management over that, the skill is finessing the decision making. And you mentioned being the role of data. Data just is about helping make the correct decisions for you, which may not be the same for somebody who's trying to solve a different problem.
What you don't measure, you can't manage. And so I imagine that you might be able to grow a certain pasture variety on one farm, but it might perform differently to another farm. I'd love to know, Graeme, from your experience of pasture persistence and what you actually see out of those pastures when you're selecting varieties. Like, how much does management come into it?
Yeah, it does seem to. I'll visit a farm next door or down the road that's relatively similar soil to our farm, and they'll say variety X has persistent issues, and I'll have a pre-release version of that pasture that's been in our paddock for the last 15 years. So management does seem to play out significantly in this, and certain varieties suit certain managers, I guess. But from our perspective, it helps us look and understand, well, hold on, I haven't renovated that paddock for 10 years, but that variety is still sitting in the top 20% of the FVI. Why would I renovate that paddock? No one's released anything that's actually going to benefit me anymore. It's an interesting conundrum for our business, because our milking platform isn't getting renovated much at all now, but the varieties that we've got in place aren't getting topped on the FVI. So not great for the pasture retailers. I can look at the FVI index each year and say, is there anything new here that I'm missing out on? No. Well, why rip up a perfectly good paddock?
And because currently persistence pops up all of the time in discussions around pastures. And I do often hear about people saying, oh, look, it's thinning out a little bit. I might just oversow with the cheaper seed. And it tends to be a bit of a trap that you can fall into. And so I'd love to hear more about how the FVI helps make those decisions for the longevity. But I know that persistence isn't currently in the FVI. And is that something that's going to be added in the future?
So I might answer that question, Mikaela. The persistence is targeted to be the next trait that we're really looking to bring into the FVI, and we're really undertaking the research now to develop the best way to get persistence in there, both in terms of measuring what persistence is at the plant level and also the economics of persistence. And Graeme, I think, covered this very nicely. We're talking about a perennial system when we're talking about perennial ryegrass, at least. And we need to look at the lifetime economics of the pasture and the fact that leaving it in there for another year avoids the cost of renovation, but what's the opportunity cost of not putting a new variety in, to use the economic term that Graeme was alluding to, in terms of saying, well, it's still going all right, and I can't quite see that the next thing pushes me over the edge to take that pasture out of my cycle. So what we need is the tools that actually inform that decision making, so you are in a better case to say, actually, this new thing is so much better that it is worth taking this paddock into a rotation perhaps a year before I might have done it in the past. So we actually see the economics of persistence as important as the sort of ground cover element, which is ultimately what you measure. So we are busy looking at that now and understanding that so we get the balance right. And farmers who have been around for a while will remember in the animal genetic evaluation that if you push too hard on productivity, you might have lost fertility and other elements. So it's really about ensuring when you bring these new traits in, which in one way might seem to be counter to productivity, that you're not driving the index in the wrong decision. But the other thing I'd say is, in some ways, it's not surprising if the evaluation is right and done in the correct environments that highly productive varieties can also be persistent, because if they've got the right endophyte, one of the best indicators for will you yield well next year is did you yield well this year? So if you've got the tillers, if you've got the productivity that drives the yield this year, you've got all the engine in place to come back well after autumn. So I think these things are not mutually exclusive, but it is that getting that lifetime productivity equation in place when you bring persistence into the index.
I kind of see pasture persistence similar to cow longevity. There's a cost to raise that cow through the rearing phase, and there's a cost to get that pasture in through the renovation phase. And if you can get one more year out of that cow or one more year out of that pasture, there's a significant profit gain for your business.
Yep. Absolutely right. And I think that's exactly the way to look at it, because you also have the element that you can't forego productivity in the early years of the pasture to have for productivity a long way in the future if you're not actually making money in those early years. So it is about getting that balance right. And I guess this is at its heart the argument as to why we need tools like the Forage Value Index or the Better Bulls Guide, because the more traits you're trying to bring in and the more aspects you're trying to balance off, the harder it is to look at all those possible varieties and come up with what suits. So I think that's, again, where using the index to say that the summary index, which is the overall weighted value, gives you an idea of the top cohort of varieties, and then you drill down to the specific needs, as Graeme talked about, of saying, well, I'm interested in varieties that have the endophytes that have shown to work on my farm. I'm interested in varieties that have better late spring and summer production, but I want to check that they are in the top group, that they're not also, so specialized about that they're not overall good performers as well.
So really, we're looking at a tool that can help every aspect of the business. So it can help animal health and particularly calf health with the endophytes. We're looking at being able to pick varieties that might even get an extra 2 to 3 tonnes dry matter per hectare available between the better and the lower quality ones. And we're looking at potentially being able to get more years out of those pastures as well. So more food, more years, less renovation costs, and healthier cows. And it's available in a table. And so, Graeme, what I'd like to hear from you is, so we have farmers that are just entering the industry, or we might have managers that are starting to take on that responsibility of pasture management decisions. But also we've got people like yourself who have quite a passion for pastures. So you're very familiar with different varieties already and their pros and cons. What's the ease of using the tool and the benefit from people who are just entering the industry, but also people who are very knowledgeable already?
Managing a dairy farm is you're managing a very complex biological system. There are so many different levers to pull, whether it be a pasture-based dairy farm or a dairy farm that's got pasture as part of a PMR or a mix. There are so many decisions to make within the farming business, getting that rotation, the grazing residuals right, and all the animal health complications. It's really, for the way I look at it within our business, why save a few dollars at sowing time for something that is going to take the same amount of effort to grow and return me less? So it's one of those complex decisions when you sow, what you sow, to take one level of complexity out and go, okay, I've now got a range of 5 or 6 different varieties here that I can choose from. I can see on this table they're going to grow in my region. It puts me in control of one component of a very, very complex decision. So right now in our business, we're actually ordering a pasture for some of our autumn sowings. And I've gone to our 2 different retailers with my suggested varieties for 2 different roles within our business and ask, this is my thought, what's your suggestion? They've come back with a nice little tables that and suggestions of why they think one thing or another. I can take their recommendations, look at the FEI, and make a balanced decision for what works for our business out of that.
Absolutely. That is fantastic. And with the focus as well moving towards multi-species pastures and the availability of pasture blends and being able to buy those, is there a risk that, and this is an open question to either of you, is there a risk that people might be buying a pasture blend and seeing quite a good mix on there, or good variety on there, but it actually being a large proportion of lower quality seeds? And is there any way that you could recommend in making more mindful decisions?
This is this is one that's a bit passionate. You've hit a soft spot for me here, Mikaela. I've been playing around with multi-species pastures since 2010, mixing lucerne and various herbs into our pastures in smaller paddocks, fiddling with this for a long time. And I think the latest research that's coming out of Ellenbank backs up what I'm seeing on our farm. The mixes that have got a reasonable pasture base within those mixes are the highest yielding mixes. Planting a multi-species mix, in my mind, isn't an excuse for planting crap grass. You need a solid base within those multi-species mixes to actually enable that mix to really thrive. So when I'm planning a multi-species mix, I go to the FEI, I pick my ryegrass, and then it gets more confusing from there on when I'm trying to choose my plantain or my chicory and my legumes. But it starts with, because I'm targeting a 30 to 40% of that mix, depending on what it is, being a really, really high quality ryegrass, because the reality is it might be a shallow seeded, annoying plant, a perennial ryegrass, but it's the most productive plant that I can find for our production system.
I might just add to what Graeme said there, that the FEI approach is not incompatible with mixes, as Graeme said. So it's a tool to say to the marketers of mixes, well, which ryegrass is in there? And Graeme's covered that off. But as farming systems change, it's actually possible to change our evaluation system to actually look at evaluating species in mixes and thinking about, are there specific ryegrasses that actually perform better in a mix than they do in monoculture? And I'd say that probably the thinking of that in the FEI space is actually most advanced in Ireland at the moment, where they are going down this path of looking at compatibility of species in their evaluation programs. And my understanding also is that Ireland, who were pioneers in this pasture profit index, most pastures sown in Ireland are actually sown as a mix anyway. So farmers in Ireland are using exactly the same approach as Graeme to use the pasture profit index tool to actually help them choose the right mixes. So I think it is really a good way to say that the science and the application come together, whether you're just sowing a ryegrass pasture or a blend.
But that's really exciting, Kevin, to hear that you have the capacity to move towards that, what ryegrasses perform well in mixes, because I think that's something that's really interesting a lot of farmers right now, which ones will perform well in mixes, and to put some real vigorous numbers around that.
Yeah. So again, we're not there yet. This is a tool that's evolving, but to remain relevant, it has to be a tool that aligns with the decision making that dairy producers are doing when they renovate their pastures.
Yes, because the goal with the multi-species pastures is to create more biodiversity and have a higher productive pasture, not to dilute costs with cheaper seeds. And so I'm really excited with where I've seen how much the FVI has developed over the years, and I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in the future, especially with you talking about the compatibility in those multi-species pastures. Is there any scope for the FVI to include more species of pastures?
Yep, absolutely. So as we test more species, and the testing regime has been focused on ryegrass because that's where most of the breeding effort has occurred. But as that changes, the Pasture Trial Network already has trials of other species out there, and it's a matter of coming up with the relative ways to weight the performance of those species. So the example I'd give, Mikaela, is we started in animals with breed-specific indices, and then you had a tool that you could say, well, within the Holstein breed or within a Jersey breed, this is how you would rank things. So that's relatively easy. If we want to say, I'd like to choose between a cocksfoot and a ryegrass to be the grass component, and I'd like a variety of each, then the similar example is thinking about a multi-breed animal evaluation index. So we borrow heavily from the science that's happened in the animal world, both dairy and beef and sheep, around how to bring these tools together. But ultimately, when you're thinking about it, once you're making the decision of saying, I am sowing grass on my farm to provide yield, quality, and sustained yield through persistence, the species in essence is the bag of genes. It's the performance that the producer wants. So we can move down that path. The major limitation to date is the lack of evaluation of the modern varieties of these new species in target environments, because a lot of the history around some of these alternative species, people's experiences are from years ago, and the evaluation and use of the newer genetics is just really getting back into place again.
And while we use those new genetics and the modern varieties, and also farms tailoring species and varieties to different areas on their farms, we have the ability to move away from the traditional Victorian ryegrass. And I see that that's used as the reference variety. Kevin, could you please explain how that works?
Yep. So we have a reference variety so that everything is benchmarked against that. And so in each of the species, there'll be the reference variety. So yes, it is Victorian in the perennial ryegrass. And you'll see that it gets, for the FVI, a base value of 0. on the overall FEI. That's not to say that it has no value. It just says we'll start it at that level, and then everything else is expressed relative to that. And likewise, when producers look at the table, they'll see that the base variety for an individual season, such as summer, it gets a value of 100, and then the others move up. So you can see, again, if you look at, as an example, the Gippsland table for summer, the difference between Victorian ryegrass at 100 and the top varieties up around about 125 to 130, there's a real significant improvement in late season productivity of those new varieties over Victorian. So one of the big trade-offs you would be making if you chose to stick with Victorian is the lack of that later season productivity at a time when you really want grass. And if you go back earlier, let's say into springtime, Victorian's not actually all that bad. So it shows that breeding programs have really focused on stretching the feed on those shoulders as opposed to just more feed in spring.
So, Kevin, I noticed on the FVI tables, and myself sitting in South Australia right now, that we don't have our own table yet. And I really loved that Graeme mentioned how he actually does already look at different tables in Ireland to help make his decisions. Could you explain how South Australians might be able to use the table now, and if there is our own table going to appear in the future?
So it's true to say that South Australia doesn't have a table now. So the first thing that dairy producers in South Australia could do is look at the tables for the other regions. And you'll see that there is actually a lot of similarity in the ranking of the varieties across the regions. It's just the minor differences in the economic values that cause some small changes. The way that we've developed the FVI is that it is actually possible to develop a table for South Australia if South Australian dairy producers would want one. And it would be a matter of working with regional experts in South Australia to come up with the tools for developing the economic weightings for the traits in the various seasons. And we do that with you to understand when feed is generally in surplus and when feed is generally in deficit in your environment, and what the substitutes you would use to buy energy or buy biomass at those times of years. And then we go to the Dairy Australia hay and grain guides to actually come up with the relative cost that you would have to bring that commodity onto your farm. So it's quite a straightforward process. So there is no reason it couldn't be done. It just hasn't been done yet.
That's fantastic. So where there's a drive, there's a possibility. And especially South Australia does have quite a mix of farming systems that do have different goals with their pastures and sort of cropping areas as well for silage and hay production. And so they are looking for specific traits. That means that they can look at all the different tables to see what lines up with what their goals are. I'd like to thank you both so much for your time. It has been very informative, and I've learnt a lot, and I really enjoyed talking to you both, Kevin and Graeme. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mikaela.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.